Except for the occasional cough and the scraping of pins, the courtroom was quiet. Leaning back in his chair was Judge Randall Wilkins, a burly guy with a sharp tongue and a penchant for disparaging those in front of him. The elderly black woman standing in the middle of the courtroom seemed fragile, and he looked down over his glasses at her. Her silver gray hair was neatly put into a bun, and her hands trembled a little. She accessorized her modest pearl necklace with a plain brown outfit. His voice brimmed with sarcasm as he laughed. "You're speaking for yourself, ma'am," he remarked, shaking his head. "This is not a communal gathering. This is a court of law. You are aware of that, are you not?" There were a few snickers in the room. The young man in the fine suit, the prosecutor, grinned as though the matter was already decided. The old woman's lips were pursed. She watched the judge with a sharp glance, but said nothing. Flipping through a file in front of him, Judge Wilkins went on. "I'll guess. After watching a few episodes of a courtroom drama, you decided to play lawyer today. I strongly suggest that you think again, ma'am. I don't have time for this situation, which is a serious matter." Then it happened. Slowly, the woman retrieved a dusty leather folder from her purse and slid it across the table in the direction of the bailiff. He reluctantly picked it up, gave it a quick look, and then his eyes widened in surprise. He handed it to the judge in a hurry. Judge Wilkins' face was devoid of pigment. His smile vanished. As he turned the pages, his hands shook a little. Once, then twice, he read the name on the papers. As though he was having trouble speaking, his mouth opened and then shut. There were gasps from the crowd. A clerk at the court almost dropped her coffee. The prosecutor's open-mouthed incredulity had replaced even his grin. The old woman cocked her head and at last spoke in a razor-sharp voice. With decades of power in her tone, she added, "Now, Judge Wilkins, do you want to respect a former Supreme Court lawyer? Or do you want to keep making fun of me?" There was a startled quiet in the courtroom. Eleanor Jackson was holding the handle of her leather briefcase as she left her modest home hours ago, just as the light was beginning to rise. She walked slowly to the courthouse after taking a deep breath and enjoying the clear morning air. In actuality, Eleanor had been in the courtroom for decades, but today was different. She wasn't entering the courthouse today as a lawyer representing a client. As a defendant, she was entering. She never thought this day would arrive. She got a startling notice a month ago. Someone was suing her. Nearly 30 years ago, she was accused of fraud in a property dispute case by Charles Duval, a wealthy real estate developer. She was charged in the lawsuit with tampering with evidence, which is a flagrant lie. Was she being accused of corruption after spending her entire life fighting for justice? Over the last few weeks, Eleanor had gone over every document and legal precedent she could locate. None of her former co-workers were willing to take on the case pro bono, despite her reaching out to them for help. It was impossible for her to get a powerful lawyer at her age. That left her with only one option. She would speak for herself. Eleanor felt the weight of history bearing down on her as she walked into the courthouse. Even though she has been through these hallways before, today was different. She was seldom noticed. She was just another old woman, past her prime, in their eyes. Someone who ought to be knitting at home rather than in a courtroom. She got to the defendant's table early and sat quietly. Charles Duval smirked as he talked to his lawyer across the room, surrounded by his team of high-priced lawyers. He was a man accustomed to achieving his goals. Eleanor inhaled deeply when the judge eventually made his appearance. This was not the hardest opponent she has ever faced. She has faced off against some of the nation's most vicious attorneys. However, she had never encountered such a challenge, one in which her legacy and reputation were at stake. As he called the proceedings to order, Judge Wilkins shuffled his papers and gave Eleanor a fleeting glance. Then, predictably, the derision started. He raised an eyebrow as he examined her from head to toe. "Ma'am, I take it you're here to ask for a public defender?" Eleanor just folded her palms together. "Your Honor, no. I'll be speaking for myself." People in the courtroom laughed. Judge Wilkins let out a loud sigh. "Do you have any prior legal experience, ma'am?" Eleanor did not answer right away this time. She allowed the pause to linger, long enough for the judge to get more impatient. "A little," she responded at last. The judge shook his head and grinned. This ought to be fascinating. A young man called Thomas Barrett, the prosecutor, rose to his feet. Before we continue, Your Honor, I would like to move to rule out the defense's right to self-representation. This woman is obviously unfit to deal with a case this serious. The magistrate gave a nod. To be honest, I concur. This is your last chance, Ms. Jackson. I strongly advise obtaining expert legal counsel. Eleanor reached into her handbag at that moment. Everything changed when her credentials were made public. The startled quiet, the gasps. Judge Wilkins's expression upon realizing that he had been making fun of a legal legend. Eleanor had made a Supreme Court argument. Her victories had altered the path of history. Nevertheless, she was being ridiculed like a fool. The judge, clearly uncomfortable, cleared his throat. Ms. Jackson, he continued in a tone that had suddenly become courteous. Yes, I had no idea what your background was. I'm sorry if... Eleanor interrupted him with a hand. Judge, save your excuses, she responded calmly. Now, let's discuss the case. Judge Wilkins gave a quick nod. He looked across at the prosecutor, who still had the appearance of someone who had been hit by lightning. Go ahead. Barrett, Mr. Barrett, Mr. Barrett took a deep breath. Yes, Your Honor, I see. Eleanor could clearly see it in his eyes as he collected his notes. He had lost the self-assurance he had brought with him. The actual conflict has hardly just started. The mood had changed in the courtroom. Eleanor Jackson was being laughed at just a few seconds ago, as if she were an elderly woman who had wandered into the wrong area. However, the environment felt different now that her true identity was known. Once arrogant and contemptuous, the judge now sat up straight, his hands folded neatly, and he cautiously observed Eleanor. The smug grin of Thomas Barrett, the prosecutor, had vanished. He was regaining control of the situation by going through his notes instead. But Eleanor stayed composed. She had spent many hours in similar courtrooms. Today, however, it was more than a case. It was intimate. Barrett cleared his throat. It doesn't matter, Your Honor, that the defense has a legal background. She has been charged with grave misbehavior. Eleanor remained unflinching. This was what she anticipated, a last-ditch effort to take back control. Barrett went on to say that Mr. Charles Duval, the plaintiff, had presented evidence indicating that Ms. Jackson had altered official property records in a case 30 years prior, resulting in an unjust decision that favored her client. We demand complete reimbursement since we think this is fraud. Judge Wilkins gave a nod. Do you want to answer before we move forward, Ms. Jackson? Eleanor got to her feet carefully. Yes, she was elderly, yet her presence demanded notice. I honor you, she said. She looked straight at Barrett. You say I tampered with property records, Mr. Barrett. Tell me, have you personally seen these purportedly forged documents? Barrett was hesitant for a brief moment. The proof? With a firm voice, Eleanor interrupted. That wasn't my question. Barrett let out a quick exhale when I asked if he had seen them. No, but my customer. Your customer? Eleanor said it again. Yes, Charles Duval, the man who has made it his job to take impoverished people's land and pass it off as urban development. Duval leaped from his chair. That's crazy, he yelled. I object to this unfounded attack on my character, Your Honor. Eleanor looked at the judge. I'm just bringing out the well-recorded history of Mr. Duval's real estate enterprise, Your Honor. Or should I provide court documents and articles on his prior fraud, land theft, and unlawful eviction lawsuits? They whispered in the courtroom. People moved about in their chairs. Judge Wilkins let out a sigh. Please make sure your remarks are pertinent to this case, Ms. Jackson. Eleanor gave a nod. Your Honor, of course. Now let's discuss this case. She approached the table of evidence. Could you please provide me the paperwork that purports to show my wrongdoing? After hesitating, Barrett nodded to his helper, who gave him a piece of yellowed paper. Eleanor accepted it and looked at it, adjusting her spectacles. Then she grinned. It was the type of smile that unnerved the other side. The smile that indicated someone had made a grave error. She looked back at Barrett. Are you familiar with forensic document analysis, Mr. Barrett? Barrett scowled. Naturally. Eleanor held out the document and remarked, Good. This document was not written 30 years ago, as anyone with half a brain can see. Barrett raised his eyebrows. I'm sorry. Eleanor put the document on the judge's desk and stepped forward. Take a look at this ink, Honor. Not even fading has occurred. This is not the appearance of paper from the 1990s unless it was stored in a vacuum-sealed vault, which Mr. Duval probably didn't. She faced the crowd. And let's verify the signature if that isn't sufficient. Eleanor took a stack of old court documents out of her briefcase. This is my signature from 1994. When this alleged fraud occurred, she claimed, displaying one. Have you noticed how I signed my last name and the shape of the letters? She put it next to the allegedly fake document. She tapped the new signature now and went on. Contrast this with the presentation made by Mr. Duval. The blow, the distance. It's entirely different. Examining the papers, Judge Wilkins leaned forward and narrowed his eyes. Barrett took a swallow. That isn't conclusive evidence. Her penmanship might have changed slightly over the years. Eleanor grinned. Oh, I thought you would say that. Reaching into her briefcase once more, she took out another document. When I notarized a contract for a nearby nonprofit last year, this is my signature. Contrast it with the purportedly phony one. As you can see, it still matches my original from 30 years ago. Judge Wilkins looked from document to document and scowled. Eleanor looked across at Barrett. Would you mind explaining, Mr. Barrett, how my signature has stayed the same everywhere else, but suddenly changed on the paper that implicates me? Barrett's mouth clenched. He didn't know how to respond. The crowd murmured. In front of them, the prosecutor's confidence was eroding. At last, Judge Wilkins spoke. I believe a handwriting specialist is needed to examine this, Mr. Barrett. Barrett gave a rigid nod. Your Honor, I understand. However, Charles Duval slammed his hand on the table before anyone could inhale again. This is absurd, he yelled. This woman is dishonest. As usual, she's attempting to get out of this. Eleanor's eyes were keen as she turned to face him. She repeated, like I always do. Is it an acknowledgement that you have attempted to discredit me previously, Mr. Duval? Duval's cheeks flushed. Don't you think you're really intelligent? Then he stepped forward and poked a finger at her. You ought to have remained in retirement. You no longer belong here. Eleanor remained unflinching. She just cocked her head instead. You appear incredibly sentimental for someone who says they have good proof. Wilkins, the judge, pounded his gavel. Enough. He looked over at Duval. I will not put up with tantrums in my courtroom, Mr. Duval. Duval's fists clenched. His whole scheme was unraveling. However, a startling event occurred as the chamber was beginning to settle. Abruptly, a man seated in the rear of the courtroom rose. Tall and dressed in a dark suit, he had remained silent the whole time. But now that everyone was staring at him, he took out a little folder and moved forward. Your Honor, he said in a steady, strong voice. I have fresh proof. Eleanor squinted her eyes. Something about the way he was staring at her made her not recognize him. It chilled her to the bone. The judge scowled. And who might you be? Placing the folder on the judge's bench, the man moved closer. With a slight, sly smile on his lips, he continued, My name is Agent Mark Hastings. The courtroom exploded with FBI. Judge Wilkins reclined in disbelief. FBI? What does this signify? Agent Hastings gave Eleanor a look. We have been looking into this matter independently, and we have found some intriguing information. Eleanor's heartbeat accelerated. There was a problem, and she wasn't sure if she had the advantage anymore for the first time since entering that courtroom. There was mayhem in the courtroom. Like wildfire, murmurs proliferate. Even Judge Wilkins, who is always so confident and in control, appeared totally taken by surprise when the FBI was brought up. Eleanor Jackson maintained a neutral face, but her thoughts were racing. FBI? There was a problem. Standing erect, Agent Mark Hastings looked around the room with his keen eyes before returning his focus to Eleanor. It was as though he had been waiting for the right opportunity to show himself, and his appearance was premeditated. Wilkins, the judge, pounded his gavel. Put in order. My courtroom will be in order. The tension in the air persisted even after the whispers subsided. The judge let out a harsh sigh. Hastings? Agent? I don't think a straightforward civil case falls under the FBI's purview. Agent Hastings smiled slightly, knowingly. You would normally be correct, Your Honor. However, this instance? It's not all easy. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. Is that correct? She folded her arms and asked. So, why don't you tell us? He put the folder on the judge's bench, and the agent touched it. There is fresh material in this file, Your Honor, that indicates this matter is more complex than a simple property dispute. The judge's eyebrows went up. Larger? How? Turning, Agent Hastings faced Charles Duval. Do you know who Harper and Westwood Investment Group is, Mr. Duval? Duval stiffened visibly. Eleanor caught it, but just for a moment. Hastings grinned. That will be interpreted as a yes. As the agent went on, the room remained silent. This case isn't just about an alleged fraud from 30 years ago, he remarked, pointing to the courtroom. It concerns a concerted attempt to overthrow one of the most renowned lawyers in American history. And the man who did it? He gestured right at Duval. Charles Duval leaped out of his chair. He snarled, "That's a damn lie." Not even Hastings flinched. Calmly, he took out a stack of papers from his folder and handed them to the judge. According to these documents, Mr. Duval's Shell Corporation Harper and Westwood Investment Group has been following Ms. Jackson's legal history for years, Your Honor. They have been looking for any means to undermine her, and when they were unable to come up with a good excuse, they made one up. The courtroom was filled with gasps. Eleanor's jaw tightened. They made this case? Judge Wilkins glanced over the documents and scowled. "This is a grave charge," he whispered. He looked over at Duval. "Have you got anything to say for yourself, Mr. Duval?" Red with rage, Duval's face lit up. "This is absurd. I don't own that business." Hastings grinned. "Really?" He looked at Barrett, the prosecutor. "Would you mind explaining, Mr. Barrett, why Harper and Westwood have paid your company several times in the last 5 years?" Barrett tensed. "That this case is unrelated to that." Eleanor gave a little laugh. "Yes, I believe it to be highly pertinent." Barrett received a scowl from Judge Wilkins. "Do you believe this, counselor?" Barrett paused, his hands clinging to the table's edges. Eleanor noticed it right away. His fear. Then Barrett did something wrong. He gave Duval a look. It was brief, but sufficient. Duval clenched his fists as the entire courtroom watched, his face shouting, "Don't you dare mess this up." However, the harm had already been done. Judge Wilkins sighed as he reclined in his chair. "This is becoming much more than the reason we are here." He gave Agent Hastings a quick look. "What specifically is the FBI looking to accomplish here?" Hastings looked at Eleanor once more. "I have a question for you, Ms. Jackson." Eleanor looked up at him. "Proceed. Have you ever dealt with a case that involved Marissa Carter?" Eleanor tensed. She had not heard that name in years. As memories came flooding back, the courtroom appeared to vanish. Carter, Marissa, a woman she had represented in one of her most contentious cases decades prior. A whistleblower who attempted to reveal corruption in the government. And a woman who had vanished for no apparent reason. Eleanor's grip on the table became more firm. "Yes," she responded softly. "In a case against a significant political figure, I defended her. Then she vanished one day." As though anticipating that response, Hastings nodded. "What if I told you that the individuals involved in this case had something to do with her disappearance?" Eleanor's breathing became labored. Judge Wilkins took a seat. "Do you mean that this whole issue has something to do with a case that happened 30 years ago?" Hastings touched the table with his hands. "Your Honor is not merely connected. The purpose of the entire litigation was to keep Ms. Jackson out of court and prevent us from learning the truth about Marissa Carter's fate." The courtroom exploded again. The walls were closing in on Eleanor. It was more than just her. It had never been. She also became aware that she might be seriously in danger for the first time since the trial started. Even though Eleanor's heart was racing, she made herself stay composed. There was anarchy in the courtroom, reporters scrambling to take notes, people murmuring, Judge Wilkins massaging his temples as though he had a headache. Charles Duval appeared to be a helpless, confined animal. His whole plan had been exposed before the court, and now that Marissa Carter had been brought up, things had taken a risky turn. Eleanor inhaled deeply as her keen intellect examined every possibility. Someone in a position of authority had been pulling strings for decades if the FBI was present and was linking this case to Marissa Carter. At last, Judge Wilkins struck his gavel once more. He barked, "Enough. You're making this courtroom into a circus, Agent Hastings. Why waited until now to intervene if the FBI had suspicions about this case?" Hastings was unmoved, because up until now, "We lack proof." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "What exactly is the proof?" The agent looked her in the eye. "Evidence indicates a cover-up has been planned for more than 30 years. And the secret to figuring it all out. Ms. Jackson, that's you." Quiet. The words were heavy and unwavering as they hung in the air. Eleanor could feel them pressing down on her chest. "Explain," she insisted. After giving a nod, Hastings faced Judge Wilkins once more. "I would like to formally seek that this case be transferred to federal jurisdiction, Your Honor. This isn't merely a civil dispute anymore. The inquiry into corruption, fabricated evidence, and possibly even murder is still ongoing." Throughout the courtroom, there were gasps. Eleanor tensed. Murder? Hastings had a serious expression. Indeed, Marissa Carter was not merely a whistleblower, as we have cause to think. She was the target. Furthermore, if our knowledge is accurate, she was murdered in order to conceal the truth. Eleanor's heart froze. Is Marissa no longer alive? It was more than just startling. It enraged me. She had been wondering about her client's whereabouts for years. It had been a cruel case. Marissa had revealed a covert financial scheme that was transferring millions of dollars from government contracts intended to aid underprivileged areas into private accounts. She had shown too much bravery. Then she disappeared one day. No goodbye notes. Simply gone. Eleanor had always thought something was wrong. However, there had never been any proof. The anger that had been suppressed for decades now sprang to the surface as I stood in this courtroom and heard those comments come from an FBI agent. It was clear that Judge Wilkins was rattled. "Hastings? Agent? This case will not be transferred to federal court unless there is a compelling reason to do so. What evidence do you possess that this case is a component of a larger conspiracy?" Hastings gestured to a woman seated close to the rear of the courtroom. She got up and moved ahead. Eleanor looked at her more closely, and her eyes grew wide. She was a serious-looking woman in her 40s wearing a dark blazer. However, she had a familiar appearance. Hastings pointed at her. "This is Angela Carter, Your Honor, the daughter of Marissa Carter." The courtroom let out another gasp. Eleanor took a deep breath. Her daughter. Angela looked across at Eleanor, and her face softened for the first time. She called it Ms. Jackson. "It's been a while since I wanted to meet you." Eleanor took a deep breath. I was unaware that Marissa had a child." Angela smiled sadly. "For my protection, she kept me hidden. I was transferred to live with a distant relative under a false identity when she vanished. I believe my mother had deserted me as a child, until I began researching her history." Hastings gave a nod. "A year ago, Angela came to us with documents she had found in an old storage unit her mother had rented before she disappeared. We concluded from those records that Marissa was killed by the same individuals she had exposed." Eleanor's fists clenched. "And you believe there is a connection to this case?" Grimly, Hastings nodded. "Indeed. Furthermore, we have evidence that Charles Duvall's business has been supporting several efforts to discredit or tarnish the reputations of important players in that case. You included." Eleanor turned to face Duvall, her piercing gaze meeting his. She whispered, "You've been after me for years. Have you not?" Duvall scoffed. "Old woman, you're crazy." Hastings grinned. "Mr. Duvall, I wouldn't be so certain about it." He produced a second paper and presented it to the magistrate. "We have verified that Charles Duvall is the owner of Harper and Westwood Investment Group, which engaged a private investigator to create the false property documents that gave rise to this case, as this recorded transaction demonstrates, Your Honor." Eleanor's breathing became labored. "It was there, the evidence." Whispers broke out around the courtroom. The reporters in the rear were frantically recording everything. The face of Judge Wilkins flushed. "Are you telling me that this whole lawsuit is a sham?" he growled. Hastings gave a nod. "Indeed, Your Honor. Furthermore, this is only a small part of a much bigger attempt to silence important people. We think that Duvall's network has been trying to hide witnesses, destroy evidence, and shield those who killed Marissa Carter." Eleanor turned to face Duvall, who was now shifting in his chair uneasily. Her voice sounded like steel as she leaned forward. She whispered, "Tell me, Charles, how long have you been filling in for them?" A frown distorted Duvall's face. "You have no idea what you're discussing." Eleanor grinned. It wasn't a smile of kindness, though. Do I not? Judge Wilkins gave him a temple massage. I need some time to go over everything, he murmured, until I can decide whether this matter stays in my courtroom or goes to federal court. We are adjourning. Then he struck the gavel. The court has been adjourned. The courtroom erupted in activity as soon as the judge stood. Angela Carter approached Eleanor just as she was about to react. Angela whispered gently, "Ms. Jackson, can we have a conversation?" Though her thoughts were still racing, Eleanor nodded. Naturally, Angela lowered her voice and looked over her shoulder. "I neglected to mention something there." Eleanor scowled. "What is it?" Angela's eyes grew gloomy. "In my mother's storage unit, I discovered something else." Eleanor felt her tummy tighten. "What?" Angela took a swallow. "A moniker." Eleanor's breathing became labored. "Whose name?" After a moment of hesitation, Angela whispered, "The one who gave the order to kill my mother." Eleanor felt her blood freeze. Angela inhaled deeply. She wrote down the name. She bent closer, and Eleanor's heart almost stopped when she said the name, since she was familiar with that name. And this was more than she could have ever dreamed, assuming it were true. Angela murmured the name into Eleanor's ear, causing her breath to catch in her throat. She hadn't heard that name in a long time. A name that was buried deep in the complex labyrinth of corruption, power, and dishonesty that she had fought against all of her professional life. Richard Langston, a senator. Eleanor slowly retreated, her fingers clutching the wooden defense table's edge. There was no ordinary politician like Langston. He was among the nation's most influential men, an experienced lawmaker, an expert manipulator, and a man whose name had been muttered for decades in shady corners. Angela looked at her face. "Do you not know him?" Eleanor let out a breath and steadied herself. "I am fully aware of who he is." Angela's jaw tightened. "So you see why my mother was murdered." Eleanor gave a nod. She never had a chance if she had anything on Langston. Before Angela could respond, Agent Hastings approached with a somber look. "We must speak. Right now." He pointed down the hall to a private conference room. With a nod, Eleanor followed, her thoughts racing. Alongside her, Angela and Hastings hurried across the packed corridor while reporters yelled questions at them. Hastings looked at Eleanor as soon as the doors closed behind them. "How familiar are you with Langston?" Eleanor let out a loud sigh. "Enough to understand that he is untouchable." Angela gave a head shake. "No more. He had something on my mother. Something enormous. However, I'm not sure what it was. A file she left behind is the only hint I have." Hastings's eyebrow went up. "What is contained in the file?" Angela lowered her voice to a whisper. "Bank documents. Accounts that are offshore. Wire transfers between a number of well-known shell corporations in Langston." Eleanor felt her heart race. "Tell me, did your mother have evidence that Langston was transferring illicit funds?" Angela gave a nod. "Indeed, and that, in my opinion, is why she was killed." Hastings combed his hair with his hand. "We have plenty of evidence to file a federal prosecution against Langston if we can validate those documents." The alternatives were already being considered in Eleanor's thinking. Whoever was responsible for the death of Angela's mother wasn't only strong. They were in a grave situation. Looking at Eleanor, Hastings turned. "The only one who can make the connections is you. From the start of Marissa Carter's case, you were involved. You were familiar with the players. And now someone has gone to great lengths to get you into this legal dispute." Eleanor's arms were crossed. Angela's voice was tense because they tried to discredit me before I could discover the truth. Or worse, there was silence in the room, since they were all aware of what worse entailed. Now Eleanor was dangerous. Furthermore, Langston and others did not accept threats. Hastings let out a sigh. "We must exercise caution. Langston won't think twice about burying this if he finds out we're after him." Angela paused. "There's more." Eleanor looked over at her. "What?" Then Angela took a tiny USB disk out of her purse. "Inside my mother's antique watch, I discovered this." Eleanor's gaze expanded. "She had evidence, you mean?" Angela gave a nod. She must have been aware that they were pursuing her. Hastings grabbed the USB and looked at it. "See what's on this, please." Eleanor let out a breath. "Then let's investigate." Hastings plugged in the drive and opened his laptop. After a brief flash, The screen displayed a single folder with the name Final Proof. Hastings opened it with a click. Dozens of documents were within. However, one file was particularly noteworthy. A film. He clicked it twice. The screen then came to life. The audio was clear, but it was fuzzy. The voice of a woman. The voice of Marissa Carter. As she spoke into the camera, her eyes darted around nervously. This indicates that they have come for me if you're viewing it. I need the world to know the truth, but I'm not sure how long I have left. Senator Richard Langston is the one in charge of everything and the man behind it all. Eleanor felt a knot in her stomach. In the video, Marissa swallowed hard. For years, Langston has operated a covert financial scheme. You name it: bribes, fraud, money laundering. Additionally, anyone who tries to stop him vanishes. Angela held onto the table's edge. In the video, Marissa drew a trembling breath. I've already received one warning from them. Told me to move away. I won't though. Not with this in my possession. Reaching off screen, she displayed a pile of papers. These bank statements demonstrate Langston's involvement with offshore accounts that were used to transfer illicit funds. I have copies spread throughout several locations. I need you to locate Eleanor Jackson in case I am hurt. The only person who can complete what I started is her. Eleanor's breathing became labored. Marissa's eyes were fixed on the camera. I apologize, Eleanor, if you're watching, but the only person who can defeat him is you. Then all of a sudden there was background noise. A loud clap, like someone pushing a door open. Marissa let out a gasp. The video suddenly faded to black. The room was silent. Deep within her shift, Eleanor sensed something. Marissa was aware. She had anticipated it. She had also trusted Eleanor to complete the task she had begun. Angela dabbed at her tears. The night before she vanished, that was captured on camera. Hastings took a seat back. It's this. The smoking gun is this. Eleanor straightened slowly. No, she firmly said. Angela scowled. No. Eleanor's eyes blazed with a fresh resolve. This is only the start. She looked over at Hastings. Before Langston discovers we have this, how long do you think we have? Hastings had a serious expression. Shortly. Eleanor gave a nod. Next, we take the first step. Angela gave her a look. What do you say? Eleanor spoke steadily. It's time to go to war, I say. But as soon as she finished speaking, boom, the structure was rocked by a powerful explosion. The lights wavered. From outside came screams. Hastings reached for his firearm. What on earth was that? Angela gripped the table tightly. Her eyes widened in terror. Eleanor felt her heart race. Then, a fire alarm went off. Through the intercom at the courthouse, a voice crackled. Alert for an emergency. Every employee leaves right away. Hastings' eyes grew gloomy. They are aware. Angela let out a gasp. The evidence is being buried. Eleanor's jaw tightened. No, not now. She reached for the USB. It was stuffed inside her pocket. Next, she glanced at Angela and Hastings. We're not rushing. Hastings gave a nod. What is the plan then? Eleanor let out a breath. We defend ourselves. And that's it. They hurriedly left the room. Into the tangle. Into the peril. And into Eleanor's greatest struggle to date. The corridors were filled with smoke. Overhead, the alarm sounded, drowning out the frantic cries of those rushing to get out. The haze was so dense that Eleanor could hardly see. However, she was certain of one thing. This was no coincidence. They were being attacked. Hastings was brandishing his weapon. His body tensed as he looked around them. We must relocate. Right now. Angela clenched her purse. Could this be merely a distraction? What if the proof is what they want? Eleanor felt for the USB drive in her pocket. We can't allow them to acquire it then. Abruptly, over the intercom at the courthouse, a voice crackled. The emergency alert wasn't your typical one. Someone else did it. The voice was deep and garbled. This is the last warning you will receive. Turn over the proof, or we'll set everything on fire. Angela's gaze expanded. They mean it. Eleanor gripped the USB more tightly. Give it a shot. Hastings gestured them to come along. We must leave this place. We can relocate to a safe place I have for us. However, 3 men in dark suits blocked their way as they rounded a bend. No badges. No identity. Only icy, merciless eyes. The tallest one, a man with his cheek scarred, moved forward slowly. Then he said, "Miss Jackson." His tone was uncannily serene. "Something that is not yours is in your possession." Eleanor was stepped in front of by Hastings. He pointed his revolver toward the man's chest. "A federal agent." "Get down." Scarface grinned. "Agent Hastings, you don't get it. This is no longer your battle." Then, the man dug into his jacket. Hastings responded immediately. Boom. The corridor reverberated with the sound of the gunshot. Scarface clutched his shoulder and stumbled backward. The other two men grabbed their firearms at once. Eleanor took Angela's hand in hers. "Run." Hastings covered them as they ran down the corridor. 2 additional bullets were fired, causing the guys to flee for safety. Angela let out a gasp. "Where are we going?" Eleanor's thoughts whirled. Most likely, the primary entrances were compromised. They had already infiltrated security. They would be captured if they stayed. Next, she recalled. The chambers of the judge, she added. Angela was dragged to a side door. "There's an exit in the back." They raced inside the judge's private office, running through the door. After they left, Angela locked the door. "Now what?" Running over, Eleanor pulled on a little wooden panel at the bottom of the bookshelf. An outdated maintenance hatch was exposed when it burst open. Angela's mouth fell open. "How are you aware of this?" Eleanor grinned. "It's impossible to work in a courthouse for 30 years and not pick up some secrets." She gestured for Angela to follow her as she crawled inside first. "Remain near." It was a damp, dark, and narrow tunnel. Years had passed since its last use. However, it led to a safer escape on the courthouse's side. "Listen to me, Angela," Eleanor said as they crawled forward. Angela spoke in a tremulous tone. "What?" "Take that USB and run if something were to happen to me. You inform the FBI and the media. Anyone who's willing to listen. You get it?" Angela paused. "You won't experience any consequences." Eleanor let out a sigh. "Make me a promise." Angela took a swallow. "I swear." The tunnel was suddenly rocked by a loud explosion. The walls trembled. Debris and dust showered down. The tunnel then fell apart. They were flung forward, smashing into the darkness as Eleanor and Angela shouted. Suddenly, everything turned black. Pain. When Eleanor came to, that was the first sensation she experienced. Her side ached and pricked. Her head pounded dully. She coughed, and her lungs filled with dust. Her body was trapped under pieces of rubble. She was momentarily unsure of her location. Then everything suddenly returned. The courtroom. The blast. The tunnel is falling apart. "Angela." Eleanor opened her eyes. "Angela." Her throat was raw as she rasped. From somewhere close came a low moan. "I'm present." Although feeble, Angela's voice was lively. Eleanor fought to get the debris off of her. She gritted her teeth and pushed harder even though her arms were shaking. She was able to release herself when the stone moved slightly. A few feet away, Angela lay with her body partially buried beneath brick and broken beams, her forehead bleeding. Ignoring the stinging agony in her ribs, Eleanor crawled near her. "I've got you, hold on." Eleanor tugged a piece of rubble from Angela's legs, and she winced. I believe I sprained my ankle." Eleanor looked at the floor. Angela's ankle was already bruised and swollen. Now, however, there was no time to be concerned about it. Eleanor responded, "We must move, before they discover us." Angela's gaze expanded. "Are they still up there, in your opinion?" Eleanor gave a sad nod. "The person who set off that explosion had no intention of killing us. They intended to ensnare us." Angela took a deep breath. "Then we were at a loss." Eleanor looked around the tunnel that had fallen. Another way out had to exist. She then noticed it. There was a tiny bit of light coming from a crevice in the rubble. "There," she gestured. "We may be able to go through if we can enlarge that gap." Angela gave a shaky sigh. "All right. My ankle, though." Beside her, Eleanor knelt. "Your arm should be around my shoulder. Together we accomplish this." Angela gave a nod. As they limped near the opening, she put her arm around Eleanor. Eleanor pushed loose bricks away as she pushed at the debris. More light entered as the aperture widened. Then, a sound, a slight shuffling of feet. Angela tensed up. "Have you heard that?" Eleanor went cold. Another sound, this one closer. A muted, low voice. They were on their way. Eleanor felt a wave of panic, but she forced herself to remain composed. She looked across to Angela. We're running out of time. Angela's respiration accelerated. What happens if they reach us before we leave? Eleanor's eyes went dark. After that, we fight. She extracted a small item, her ancient pocket knife, from her coat pocket. Even though it wasn't much, it was still better than nothing. Angela's hands were shaking. Eleanor, I can't fight. Eleanor took her shoulder in her hands. Then you take off running. I'll buy you some time. Fear entered Angela's gaze. No, I will not abandon you. Eleanor paused. Next, crunch. The boot treading on loose debris. Here were the mails. Eleanor's heart raced. They were discovered in a matter of seconds. She looked at the aperture. It was about sufficiently wide. She decided. Angela, she muttered. You creep through that gap when I say go. Regardless, Eleanor gave Angela no time to speak, despite the protest in her eyes. Overhead, a darkness loomed. Then, there was a gunshot. Only a few inches from Eleanor's head, the bullet bounced off the stone wall. Someone had seen them. Proceed. Angela was shoved toward the opening as Eleanor yelled. Angela paused. After that, she crawled as quickly as she could. Eleanor faced their assailant. Above them, on the rubble pile, stood a man dressed in black combat gear. A firearm pointed straight at her chest. Give it to me, he said. Eleanor's fingers gripped her pocket's USB more tightly. Her smile was icy. Come take it. The man jerked his jaw. He took a step forward. Eleanor then lunged. Grabbing a piece of shattered brick, she threw it at him. He ducked, but she only needed the diversion moment. She took off running. The man shot again, and she jumped toward the opening. She had a minor wound from the bullet, causing a searing ache in her shoulder. However, she continued. She pushed her way through the gap. She fell outdoors onto the pavement, scraping her hands and legs. And Angela was there already, breathing heavily. Her face went white with fear. Hurry up! Eleanor's arm was taken by Angela. Raising her up, an alley behind the courthouse was where they fell. There was mayhem on the street ahead, wailing sirens. People are yelling. There are security guards running toward the building's entrance. They had gone unnoticed. Eleanor tightened her jaw, clutching her arm that was bleeding. We must vanish. Right now. Still trembling, Angela nodded. Where are we going? Eleanor's thoughts whirled. They required a secure location. They would travel somewhere Langston's men wouldn't anticipate. Then she recalled. A man is there, she said hastily. A reporter. Kravitz David. He has spent years pursuing Langston. He's the one who can help us. Angela paused. Is he trustworthy? Eleanor let out a breath. There is nothing we can do. Sirens sounded more loudly. They would soon be pursued by the men from the tunnel. Eleanor took Angela's hand in hers. Come on, let's go. They vanished into the metropolis, disappearing into the darkness, possessing a secret strong enough to defeat the nation's most dangerous individual. Eleanor was convinced of one thing as she looked down at the blood on her sleeve. The war was only getting started. As Eleanor and Angela navigated the tangle of alleys, the city lights flickered. They were breathing in harsh, piercing gasps. Every shadow seemed dangerous. Every siren in the distance is a warning. Eleanor's arm ached from the blood. She endured the torture, nevertheless. There was no time for them to pause. Angela took a quick look behind her. Are they still pursuing us, in your opinion? Eleanor continued to concentrate. No, not just yet. The courthouse remains in disarray. We have an advantage because of that. Angela gripped her back more tightly. And Kravitz, this journalist. Do you truly believe him? Eleanor gave a nod. He has spent years pursuing Langston. He is the only one who is as desperate to expose the truth as we are. Angela paused. What if they follow us directly to him? Eleanor let out a sigh. He will then be aware of the danger he faces, and he will take advantage of it if he is intelligent. They slipped past a poorly lighted petrol station and came out onto a peaceful street. Eleanor whispered, we must disconnect from the grid. Angela glanced around. How? On the corner, Eleanor noticed an old payphone, among the handful that are still standing. She took Angela by the arm. Remain near. When they arrived at the phone, Eleanor took several quarters out of her pocket. She hurriedly inserted them and dialed a number she remembered. Once the line rang, twice, a rough voice then responded. "Who is this?" Eleanor inhaled deeply. "David. Eleanor Jackson is here." Quiet. Then a quick gasp for air. Kravitz mumbled, "Damn. I wanted to know when you would call." Eleanor looked around her. "We must get together. Right now." Kravitz let out a sigh. "I assumed. Didn't they place a target on your back?" Eleanor made no effort to confirm. "Do you remain at your previous safe haven?" "No, Kravitz. Too warm. I'll see you at the deserted train station." "You're aware of it?" Eleanor scowled. "For years, that location has been abandoned." "Just right," Kravitz said. "No cameras. No irs. Come by yourself." Eleanor glanced over to Angela. "Someone is coming with me." Kravitz paused, then mumbled, "All right, but move quickly. Langston's guys will not give up if they are pursuing you." The line died. Eleanor looked across at Angela. "We're meeting." Angela took a swallow. "In a rail station where nobody goes, with a man we don't know?" Eleanor's mouth quirked. "I never claimed that this would be simple." Angela let out a sigh. "Then, before I decide otherwise, let's go." As they moved swiftly, they vanished into the silent streets and made their way to the location where they hoped to get answers. However, a black SUV rolled slowly by them as they were moving. The window drooped a little. Eleanor felt nauseous. She knew without seeing their faces. They had been located by Langston's men. She took Angela's hand in hers. "Run." Eleanor dragged Angela into a sprint, scuttling between parked automobiles before she could even respond. The engine of the SUV roared. Next, tires squealed. They were cut off on the opposite side of the road by a second vehicle. Angela let out a gasp. They were anticipating our arrival. Eleanor felt her heart race. "We must lose them." A tiny passageway between two buildings caught her eye. In this manner, as the men spilled out of their cars, they ran inside. Acquire them. The pursuit was underway. The sound of thumping footsteps crept in behind Eleanor and Angela as they climbed over fences and swerved through trash. "Jackson, you can't run forever," yelled one of the men. Eleanor paid him no attention. Just above them, she noticed an ancient fire escape ladder. "Climb." She gave an order. Angela paused. However, Eleanor's encouragement enabled her to seize the corroded metal and haul herself to her feet. Eleanor trailed after, wailing in agony from her damaged arm. Eleanor's feet had hardly left the ground when the men arrived at the alley. A gun was raised by one of them. Boom! Sparks flew as the bullet struck the metal stairway. Angela let out a scream. Eleanor tightened her jaw. Continue ascending. Panting, they arrived to the rooftop. Angela nervously glanced around. What comes next? Up here, we're confined. Eleanor looked at the horizon. The roofline extended in every direction. Next, she caught sight of it. Two buildings are connected by a slender metal beam. She looked across to Angela. We come into contact. Angela's face went white. Are you crazy? Eleanor grinned. I believe we had discussed that. Below, the men yelled. They were ascending. No time to quarrel. Eleanor's heart pounded as she walked onto the beam. She continued to move, even though it swayed a little under her weight. After hesitating, Angela followed. The wind screamed. The city was far below. They would tumble if they took one incorrect step. However, they were at a loss. Eleanor arrived at the opposite end. I'm just helping Angela. The men arrived at the roof. They cursed when they came to a stop at the beam. They were all afraid to follow. Eleanor grinned. I suppose they have a fear of heights. Angela continued to tremble. I've never done something as stupid as that. Eleanor gave her a shoulder clap. Greetings from my universe. On the other side, they down a ladder and eventually arrived to the streets. Angela let out a loud sigh. We lost them, I believe. Eleanor gave a nod. For the time being. She dragged Angela over to a side street. A few blocks distant stood the deserted train station, and it was time to reveal the truth if Kravitz had the answers they required. But Eleanor knew in her gut. Langston had not yet finished them. By no means. In the distance, the corroded metal structure of the abandoned rail station stood out against the moonlight. Once a thriving center, The historic edifice was now merely a forgotten artifact. Just an empty shell of broken glass and decaying brick with no lights or people. The crumbling pavement masked Eleanor and Angela's footsteps as they approached warily. The city's distant hum and the odd groan of metal shifting in the wind were the only sounds audible. Angela shuddered. I get creeps from this spot. Eleanor looked into the darkness. Excellent. This indicates that nobody else wishes to attend. A corroded metal gate hung off its hinges when they arrived at the entry. It screeched loudly, and Eleanor pushed it away, squirming. Angela flinched. What a waste of slinking in. Eleanor remained silent. She was too preoccupied. The huge, deserted station loomed before them as they entered. Dust coated the long-abandoned ticket booths. The walls have graffiti on them. The floor was littered with a few shattered benches. Then, in the distance, one light flickered. Eleanor's body stiffened. They weren't by themselves. With her instincts sharpened, she moved ahead of Angela. Remain near. Angela took a deep breath. They made their way through the ruins of the former station in the direction of the light. They moved more into the shadows thanks to the dim glow, and eventually a figure appeared. Kravitz, David. Eleanor recalled him as tall and slender, with graying hair and piercing, calculating eyes. His face was unreadable, and he wore a trench coat. Kravitz shook his head and let out a breath. Oh no, Jackson. You certainly have a knack for making an impression. Eleanor's arms were folded. You chose a fantastic location for the gathering. Kravitz grinned. They won't dare to look there. I'm sure of it. Angela stepped forward tentatively. Aren't you David Kravitz? He gave a nod. You must also be the child of Marissa Carter. Angela tensed up. How are you aware of that? Kravitz gave a shrug. Because I first became interested in Langston because of your mother. Eleanor's mouth clenched. Then you were aware of the stakes. Kravitz stopped grinning. Yes, I do. Eleanor extracted the USB by reaching into her pocket. We have proof. Kravitz picked up the tiny gadget and flipped it over in his hands. And what precisely am I observing? Angela moved forward. Bank documents. Transfers via wire. Evidence suggests Langston has spent years using shell corporations to launder money. Kravitz whistled quietly. That would be sufficient to expose the entire situation. Eleanor spoke firmly. This must be made public. Kravitz scowled. Not as easy as it seems. Half of the nation's media is under Langston's control. They will stop at nothing to bury it as soon as they learn that we have this. Angela's expression dimmed. What do we do then? Kravitz let out a breath. We strike them where the pain is, quick and hard. Eleanor gave a nod. Then we let it slip. Kravitz's eyebrow went up. To whom? Eleanor made a snap decision. Everyone. She looked across to Angela. Your mom wasn't fighting by herself. Nor will we. Determination blazed in Angela's eyes. Let's then complete the task, she began. After examining them for a while, Kravitz nodded. All right, he said. Let's destroy Langston with fire. However, he heard a single gunshot as he reached for his laptop. An adjacent window was smashed by the bullet. Angela let out a scream. Eleanor's intuition took over. Down. Grabbing the USB, Kravitz stuffed it into his pocket. Someone has been following us. Eleanor's thoughts whirled. How? They were lost. Kravitz muttered an expletive. Not important. They've arrived. The metal beams above them were struck by another shot. Eleanor felt her heart race. We must relocate. Eleanor took Angela's hand and dragged her toward the rear exit as she was paralyzed with terror. Kravitz followed closely behind them. We require a diversion. Eleanor's gaze strayed to a dilapidated, corroded control panel along the railroad rails. In an instant, she decided. Prepare to run. Kravitz scowled. Who are you? Eleanor ran over to the panel and pounded a big red button with her hand. A shrill scream reverberated throughout the station. The air was filled with noise when the emergency train alarm sounded. Angela put her hands over her ears. How on earth did you just do that? Eleanor's eyes were angry as she looked back. Purchased a few seconds for us. Just long enough for them to run for the rear entrance. The firing ceased. Kravitz pushed a side door open. Hurry up. Their feet banging on the concrete, they exploded into the night air. There were shouts from behind them. Scrambling through the station were Langston's men. They took off running, across deserted streets, past structures that have been abandoned, until at last a car in front of them screamed to a stop. With his revolver out, Hastings leaped out. Enter. Eleanor made no inquiries. Before plunging in herself, she pushed Angela within. Kravitz trailed behind and slammed the door. The gas pedal was floored by Hastings. The automobile sped ahead as the tires squealed. Angela let out a gasp. How did you discover us? Hastings tightened his jaw. I have been following the guys of Langston. I knew you were in trouble when I watched them make their way to the station. Eleanor let out a breath. We have proof. Hastings kept his gaze fixed on the road. Excellent. All we have to do now is live long enough to put it to use. However, headlights flooded the rearview mirror before Eleanor could react. An SUV that is black, and it was approaching quickly. Hastings swore. Hold on tight. The SUV picked up speed. Then, it collided with them. As the automobile lurched severely, Angela yelled. Hastings held onto the steering wheel. Their goal is to drive us off the road. Eleanor looked over at Kravitz. Are you armed? He grinned. Do I appear foolish? He reached into his coat and took out a revolver. Eleanor picked it up. The window was rolled down. Inhaled deeply. Next, she fired. The SUV's tire was hit by the bullet. The car made a sharp swerve, then whirled uncontrollably. Sparks flew as it collided with a street lamp. Angela let out a gasp. Did we? Eleanor let out a breath. They've fallen. Hastings continued to move quickly. Not for very long. From where they came, Langston has more. Eleanor looked across at him. Then it gets dark. No cell phones. No interaction. Only the truth and us. Angela's hands were shaking. Her gaze, however, remained steady. Now where are we going? Eleanor gazed at the skyline of the city. Her chest was blazing with determination. To the one location that Langston has no control over. Kravitz grinned. Where is that to? A knowing smile curved Eleanor's lips. The conflict was far from done in Washington, D.C. It was only getting started. Under the darkness, the route was lengthy and deserted. Hastings never stayed on one road for too long, driving swiftly and precisely through the freeways. They had an advantage for the time being, but Langston's men would be pursuing them. Seated in the passenger seat, Eleanor held the USB firmly in her injured hand. For this small bit of plastic, she had put her life in danger. Evidence of decades of murder, blood money, and corruption. Evidence that might topple one of the nation's most influential leaders. Eyes heavy with fatigue, but yet blazing with will, Angela sat in the back, her ankle propped up on the seat. Kravitz sat next to her, reviewing encrypted information while typing frantically on his laptop. Hastings gave Eleanor a quick look. Are you certain about this? Eleanor made a snap decision. We must be in D.C. if we wish to overthrow Langston. Kravitz laughed without humor. D.C. crawling beside his folks. Do you really think we'll just show him? Eleanor looked across at him. We're going to do precisely that. Kravitz gave a headshake. You're brave, Jackson. However, having guts won't save your life. Angela raised her voice. Are there any allies in Washington, D.C.? Hastings let out a sigh. A couple. I wouldn't trust many with this. After giving it some thought, Eleanor nodded. Someone I know is out there. Daniel Whitmore, a senator. Hastings' eyebrow went up. Whitmore? Is this the same Whitmore who has been rivaling Langston for years? Eleanor grinned. That's the one. Angela scowled. Is he trustworthy? Eleanor let out a breath. I'm not sure. He's our greatest chance, though. Kravitz gave his laptop a tapping. We must first decrypt a few of these files before proceeding. It's not simply financial records on this USB. Transaction logs, video recordings, and something called Project Dominion are all present. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. What on earth is that? Kravitz pressed the file button. It is secured by encryption of the highest caliber. It's not simply shady money. This is a significant event. Hastings cursed in a low voice. Langston is more than a dishonest politician. He is pursuing a more profound goal. Eleanor gripped the seat tighter. Angela spoke in a tremulous tone. What if my mom was aware of this? What if she was slain for this reason? Kravitz raised his head. Then we just discovered the secret. The automobile was silent. Then distant headlights came into view. Eleanor's heartbeat accelerated. Is that right? Hastings interrupted her. We're not alone. The lights got closer. Too quickly. They located us. Hastings whispered. Kravitz shut down his computer. How on earth did they find us? Angela's face went white. Was the USB susceptible to hacking? Hastings gave a headshake. They're probably keeping an eye on every road between here and Washington, D.C. Eleanor let out a loud sigh. Let's then make them earn it. Behind them, the black SUVs picked up speed. 3 of them, closing quickly. Hastings tightened his jaw. Wait a moment. The gas pedal was slammed. The vehicle stumbled ahead. The speedometer rose. The SUVs followed. Eleanor looked over at Kravitz. Give me another firearm. Grinning, Kravitz produced a little revolver from inside his coat and gave it to her. Angela widened her eyes and said, Try not to miss. Are we firing back? Hold on. Eleanor remained silent. She aimed and rolled down her window. In an attempt to flank them, the first SUV veered to the side. Eleanor let out a breath. Pull the trigger. Avoid pulling it. She fired. The SUV's hood was hit by the bullet. Sparks were flying. The motorist lost control for a second when he flinched. They were blocked from the opposite side by the second SUV. Kravitz swore. They're enclosing us. A glance at the rearview mirror caught Hastings' attention. If I can avoid it, no. He gave the wheel a yank. Hard. The vehicle crossed a narrow service road and veered off the highway. The SUVs came next. Angela gripped the chair. You have a plan, tell me? Hastings smiled. As I go along, I'm making it up. Eleanor loaded again. Excellent. I am too. The SUVs got closer. Next, one of them banged its side into their automobile as it moved ahead. They skidded from the hit. The tires made a shriek. Angela let out a scream. Hastings struggled for dominance. Oh no. Eleanor made a snap decision. She fired 2 shots into the front tire of the SUV while leaning out the window. The tire blew up. The SUV veered off course, crashing into a tree and catching fire. Angela let out a gasp. Holy! Hastings continued to move quickly. There are 2 left. They were struck from behind by the second SUV. The vehicle lurched ahead. Kravitz swore. They won't let us leave. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. Then we deny them the opportunity. She looked across to Angela. Get behind the wheel. Angela's gaze expanded. What? She protested, but Eleanor ignored her. She climbed halfway out of the window after unbuckling her seatbelt. Kravitz took hold of her arm. Are you crazy? Eleanor remained silent. She ascended to the rooftop. Around her, the wind howled. The second SUV arrived next to them. A man with a gun leaned out. Eleanor was the first to move. She took aim. Boom! The man sagged. He dropped his revolver from his grasp. The SUV's driver swerved wildly in fright. Then, the car overturned. It crashed into the ditch after rolling 3 times. Angela let out a scream. Eleanor returned to the vehicle. Eleanor had no time to answer. The last SUV struck them forcefully. The vehicle stumbled. Eleanor stumbled and fell. She let her hand slip. Then she started to fall. Angela let out a scream. Eleanor fell to the ground, rolling vigorously. Her body was torn apart by the impact. But she made herself get up. She cleared her throat, tasting blood. Her vision became hazy. To a halt, the SUV skidded. The doors were opened. Boots slammed to the floor. Men dressed in suits. The men of Langston. With a gun, one of them moved forward. Eleanor made an effort to stand, but her chest was struck by a big foot, holding her in place. Above her came a familiar, chilly voice. Well. Eleanor's heart froze. She raised her head and discovered herself looking directly into Charles Duvall's face. His smile was cruel. Jackson, you've been such a pain. Eleanor gave a scowl. Not finished yet. Duvall laughed. Yes, I believe you are. He brought his gun up. She pointed it straight at her forehead. In the distance, Angela let out a scream. A skid brought Hastings' vehicle to a halt. Eleanor's thoughts whirled. She had a single second. Just one shot. Next, the air reverberated with a loud crack. Duvall stumbled behind him. He dropped his gun. Across his chest, blood blossomed. Then, he fell. Eleanor let out a gasp. Behind him, rifle-smoking a lone guy stood. Angela let out a gasp. Shock pierced Hastings' voice. Whitmore, Daniel Whitmore, a senator, brought his weapon down. He had a serious expression. He spoke steadily, too. "We must leave. Right now." The gunshot was still ringing in Eleanor's ears. As she lay on the chilly sidewalk, her chest heaved. Gazing at Charles Duvall's still body, blood gathered about him. His dead eyes widened in surprise. She had no time to think about it. "Rise." The order came from Senator Daniel Whitmore. He brought his rifle down. There will soon be more of them. Kravitz and Hastings sprinted in Eleanor's direction, dragging her to stand up. Angela, still shaking. Between Whitmore and the fallen Duvall, they looked. "Did you just?" she muttered. Whitmore remained silent. His eyes didn't waver. Concentrated. "Before they reassemble, we have 10 minutes. Get moving." Angela paused. However, Eleanor took her shoulder in her hands. "There isn't any time." Angela nodded and gulped hard. They ran to the black SUV owned by Whitmore, parked a short distance from the crash site. Whitmore got into the steering wheel. Hastings, meanwhile, sat on the passenger side. Eleanor, Kravitz, Angela then clambered into the rear. The sound of the doors slamming. Whitmore pressed the accelerator. The SUV took off, escaping the turmoil and bloodshed. Eleanor let out a loud sigh, looking at Whitmore. "How did you discover us?" Whitmore continued to focus on the road. "I've spent a lot of time watching Langston. I saw the TV report on the courthouse explosion, as well as when I learned of the highway shootout. I was certain it was you." Angela trembled. "Duvall was shot by you." Whitmore gripped the wheel more tightly. "Eleanor would be killed by him." Kravitz sat up straight. "We have the evidence to dismantle Langston. However, we must find a means to remove it before he buried it." Whitmore tightened his jaw. "It won't be simple." Grimly, Hastings nodded. "Law enforcement, the media, and half of Congress are all under Langston's influence. Not even the FBI is secure. We're dead if we make one mistake." Eleanor's thoughts moved swiftly. "We must then adopt a strategic approach. Dropping the files online is not an option. Before the public even gets a chance to view the truth, Langston will paint it as fake news." Whitmore let out a sigh. "One path exists." Eleanor's eyebrow went up. "I'm paying attention." Whitmore paused, then said something. "A hearing in the Senate." Angela blinked. "Listen." Whitmore gave a nod. "In Congress, Langston has adversaries. Enough, but not many. He cannot put an end to this without attracting even more attention if we take it to the Senate floor as a formal corruption investigation." Kravitz scowled. "What gives you the impression that he won't simply buy his way out of it?" Whitmore's eyes grew gloomy. "Since we won't merely provide the proof, we'll reveal everything. His involvement in Marissa Carter's murder, his financial misdeeds, and his connections." Angela's breathing became labored. "Do you think we're real?" Through the rearview mirror, Whitmore looked back at her. "Your mother was someone I knew. She was a decent lady. I also knew she was being honest. However, I was unable to stop Langston at the time." Eleanor's arms were folded. "And now?" Whitmore let out a breath. "I do now." Eleanor gave a nod. "Then we take action. We defeat him on the largest stage imaginable." Whitmore gripped the wheel more tightly. "After that, we must act quickly. Tomorrow morning is the hearing." Angela's gaze expanded. "So soon?" Whitmore gave a nod. "Langston will shut it down before we can say anything if he finds out. Before he understands what's occurring, we must enter the Capitol." Kravitz smiled. "This just become intriguing." Then again, Bee's the Whitmore's cell rang. He took a quick look at the screen. His face went white. Eleanor felt nauseous. "What is it?" Whitmore spoke in a somber tone. "Langston is aware." There was silence in the car. "How?" Angela murmured. Whitmore's jaw tightened. "A leak. He was alerted by someone. Just now, he summoned a press conference." Eleanor muttered an expletive. "He's going to surpass us." Whitmore turned to Hastings. "The press conference is where?" Whitmore's face grew serious. "Capitol Hill. An hour." Angela's respiration accelerated. "He will be in charge of the story if he speaks first. He'll accuse us of being criminals. Before we even present the evidence, discredit it. Kravitz sat up straight. Then we showed up for the party. Whitmore's eyebrow went up. I'm sorry. Kravitz smiled. We confront him about it. The hearing is not something we wait for. We break the news conference and reveal the truth on national television in real time. Angela's gaze expanded. Is that even feasible? Eleanor grinned. If we go quickly, it is. Hastings let out a loud sigh. That's crazy. Eleanor gave a nod. So is allowing Langston to prevail. After giving it some thought, Whitmore nodded. All right, he said. Come on, let's create history. The gas pedal was slammed. The SUV sped ahead, heading straight for the Capitol. It was almost time for the last battle. Eleanor wasn't going to back down this time either. The black SUV raced in the direction of Capitol Hill. In a blur, the city lights flashed by. Tension permeated the air within the car. It was this, the last conflict. Eleanor remained motionless in her chair. Despite her weariness, her thinking was razor sharp. With only one chance to do it correctly, they were going to face one of the strongest men in the nation. Whitmore maneuvered through traffic lanes with surgical accuracy, driving like a man possessed. Pale but resolute, Angela clutched the USB as if it were her lifeblood. Setting up a direct feed to broadcast the proof to all of the major news networks was Kravitz's task on his laptop. With his mouth clenched, Hastings examined his rifle. It was only a few minutes to the Capitol. Whitmore caught Eleanor's attention. What is our point of entry? Whitmore didn't lose sight of the road. The front stairs are being used for Langston's press conference. Strict security. Without a diversion, we won't get close. Angela appeared anxious. What if they forbid us from speaking? Kravitz grinned. We then forced them to pay attention. Hastings scowled. And just how do we go about doing that? Kravitz gave his laptop a tapping. The press conference feed was compromised by me. I'll override their live stream and broadcast our evidence as soon as we enter that crowd. Eleanor gave a nod. Excellent. However, we will still have to overcome security. Whitmore had a serious expression. It won't be simple there. The Capitol Police are owned by Langston. They will eliminate us before we can even open our tongues if they recognize us. Eleanor grinned. After that, we blend in. Angela's gaze expanded. Mixon? How? Eleanor's gaze was fixed on the window. Reporters were waiting for the start of the news conference near the Capitol entrance. She faced the group once more. As journalists, we enter. Hastings scowled. Credentials will be checked. Whitmore gave Kravitz a nod. You think you can feign some? Kravitz smiled. Please. It's kid-friendly. After taking a small printer out of his luggage, he had ready-to-use forged press passes in a matter of minutes. Eleanor adjusted her posture and took one. Okay, we enter. We get up close and reveal Langston in real time. Angela took a deep breath. What if he makes an attempt to stop us? Eleanor's eyes become stony. We then push his hand. The Capitol steps. 10:57 a.m. It was a huge audience. In front of the Capitol, dozens of reporters, flashing cameras, and live news crews had assembled in anticipation of Langston's big announcement. Whitmore, Kravitz, Hastings, Angela, and Eleanor all moved in like ghosts and blended in perfectly with the press. Their fake IDs easily passed examination. After navigating through the mob, they came within a few feet of the podium. The scene was set, but Langston was not yet there. Eleanor's heart raced. Kravitz muttered, I'll take control of the live feed as soon as Langston begins speaking. You must take the microphone when that occurs. Make it matter. Eleanor gave a nod. The crowd then became silent. With security on either side, Senator Richard Langston came out of the Capitol doors. His stride was solid, and his expression was a mask of confidence. He walked over to the podium and grinned affably at the cameras. Then he said something. Thank you for coming today, ladies and gentlemen. This meeting was organized in response to a very concerning attempt to discredit me. Eleanor tightened her jaw. Langston went on. Some people try to use false evidence to mislead the public. Desperate people who have tried to drag me down by engaging in criminal conduct. Angela clenched her fists. He is reversing the narrative. Langston grinned strategically. These people are dangerous, and their ludicrous claims are unsupported by evidence. Kravitz then pressed a button. Behind Langston, all the screens flickered. After the live show ended, Marissa Carter's farewell video played. The audience let out a gasp. Langston's expression turned white. The recorded voice of Marissa Carter echoed on the enormous screens behind him. Senator Richard Langston is the man in charge of everything. So if you're watching, it means they've come for me. Langston turned abruptly. He balled his hands into fists. Stop the feed. He let out a bark. Although security hurried, it was too late. The audience was already responding. Questions were being shouted by reporters. As the whole extent of Langston's corruption was revealed on live television, people screamed in horror. Then Eleanor shifted. She took the microphone from the podium and moved forward. Security at Langston moved to halt her. Whitmore and Hastings, however, stopped them. Eleanor spoke with a clear, firm, and fiery voice. Richard Langston has been using deception, theft, and murder to safeguard his empire for 30 years. He has deceived this nation. However, she displayed the USB today. The truth prevails now. The audience burst out. Langston lost his temper. He said, "Arrest them." However, the FBI showed up first this time. Federal officials swept through the throng in a swarm. When they got close to Langston, he froze. A badge was shown by one of the agents as they moved forward. "You are being arrested for conspiracy, fraud, and obstruction of justice, Senator Richard Langston." Langston's gaze expanded. "This is not possible. This town is mine." Cuffs were locked around his wrists by the agent. "No more." The audience let forth a roar. The cameras flashed. Langston resisted wearing the handcuffs. However, his time was up. Angela muttered, tears welling up in her eyes. "We succeeded." Eleanor put a hand on her shoulder and turned to face her. "It was your mom." Kravitz grinned as Langston was hauled off. "Okay, Jackson, what is it like to overthrow Washington's most powerful man?" Eleanor let out a breath. "It seems like justice." The conflict was over. The truth had prevailed. Eleanor Jackson was relieved that Marissa Carter could now finally rest in peace for the first time in a long time.